We've all been there before. You sit down and you eat an entire sheet cake in one sitting, and then you're like, oh man, I did that again. So we have to look at how the body works. How do we control our glucose a little bit? How do we come down off of that whole sheet cake experience, maybe modulate our glucose a little bit? Or what can we do right after the fact? Or maybe even combined with the food to make sure that we don't go sky high with our blood glucose and then come crashing down, right? Well, let's go ahead and jump right in. We'll get into the biochemistry because that's just how this channel rolls. But the first thing that you could do if you start seeing your blood glucose going sky high, sounds cliche, but just exercise, okay? But don't just go for like a regular run or something. Move your whole body, okay? And if you don't have room to move your body, literally even flexing muscles and making it so that your muscles are having to contract, that can actually do something, believe it or not. But doing some air squats, doing some push-ups, moving the full body in a resistance training fashion could be one of the best ways to translocate what is called GLUT4. GLUT4 is a transporter. It is a transporter that transports glucose into the cell. And what happens is GLUT4 is usually stored inside the cell, okay? And then what happens is after we consume carbohydrates, we have glucose and insulin comes by, and that triggers a signal for this GLUT4 to fuse to the membrane of the cell, the gooey outside fluid membrane of the cell, comes to the outside and it fuses to it. And then it can grab glucose out of the bloodstream and bring it in the cell. So what happens when we exercise, and why this happens, is we drive up what is called AMPK. So what happens when this AMPK is activated is it drives up a signaling protein that triggers, you guessed it, that GLUT4 to translocate, and then it grabs the glucose out of the bloodstream. But there's another interesting thing that happens when we exercise and we drive up AMPK. You may not really think much of it, but we're driving some more blood flow. Well, what exactly is happening? Well, there's a reason behind it. Okay, when AMPK activates and gets elevated because we are exercising, well, sort of a secondary response is what is called the activation of ENOS, or stimulation of ENOS. Okay, ENOS is a precursor to nitric oxide. When we have more nitric oxide, that dilates the blood vessels, so more blood flow is able to get to the muscle. So think about it like this. You have more blood flow rushing to a muscle, all while having GLUT4 translocating to the surface of a cell. That means more blood flow carrying the glucose, delivering it to the muscle where it can get absorbed. So you're sort of expediting the removal or the disposal of that glucose, which is a very important thing. So that's like number one, and that's something you can do 5 minutes after you eat, 10 minutes after you eat, 30 minutes after you eat, and you can watch it directly. Like if you were wearing a continuous glucose monitor like I wear, you'll see it. Like you'll see it pretty quickly after you exercise. And which, by the way, before I get into the next one, which is really interesting, talking about Vinegar, I want to recommend a continuous glucose monitor for people that are just like focused on weight loss and looking at just their metrics and want to know their data. It's called Signos. They are today's video sponsor. They totally have the Thomas DeLauer stamp of approval on them. They are way good to go. So it allows you to have access to a continuous glucose monitor. You can have a telehealth consult with a doc, you can talk with them, you can get the continuous glucose monitor, and then you look on your app on your phone and you can see everything pretty much in real time. So it's like if I go and I eat that whole sheet cake, I'm gonna see it spike up. And then when I go do my squats, I can see it come back down. So if you're trying to kind of learn about your body, definitely recommend you check them out. So there's a link down below. You just go to signos.com/Thomas. Again, signos.com/Thomas. This is seriously a game changer, one of very few products that I actually put my stamp on. So definitely check them out after this video, and you too can be super cool running around with a continuous glucose monitor, knowing how foods make you react.
What makes Signos super unique is that it's not just a continuous glucose monitor, it's not just access to that. It has an entire system to help you track your food, see how you respond to food, know when to exercise, know when your glucose is spiking, and it helps coach you through. And then it's algorithmically driven, so it learns as you go. So you start to learn how you respond to given foods and how you respond to given exercise. It's kind of like having a blood glucose coach. It's not just monitoring your glucose. So the entire Signos app makes that entirely possible, which is really what makes this so unique. It's not just a regular continuous glucose monitor. Signos is in this for the long haul, so it's not about just getting a quick snapshot in time. It's about taking that snapshot and then doing something with it and helping people truly change their lifestyle. It's seriously one of the most awesome things I've ever seen.
Next one, apple cider vinegar, or vinegar in general. Okay, there was a study that was published in the Annals of Nutrition and Metabolism. This one was really interesting because it was a randomized crossover design study, which is a great study design. So they had 4 groups, and out of these groups, one group was a group of type 2 diabetics. Okay, so what they did is they set it up so there was a standardized meal for all the groups. Okay, so dinner, whatever, standardized meal. They all ate the same thing, okay, followed by a 10-hour fast. Of course, there was a 2-hour period where they were testing glucose as well. Well, what they found was pretty fascinating when it came down to vinegar. They found that 2 teaspoons of vinegar taken with that meal reduced their postprandial glucose by 20%. Postprandial means after the meal. 20% just by having 2 teaspoons of vinegar. Pretty wild. Now, this was especially the case when there were complex carbs in the meal, right? So if you have carbs that maybe digest a little bit slower, but they're still going to drive your glucose up, well, having vinegar in the equation really seemed to make a big difference. A better difference than if they had the vinegar a few hours before the meal, which is fascinating. So that leads us to find that, well, maybe we could have some apple cider vinegar with a meal, and it might make it so the blood glucose doesn't spike quite as high. Now, what's the mechanism here? Because I'm all about the mechanism of action. Well, acetic acid, which is the primary constituent in vinegar, it doesn't have to be apple cider vinegar, but vinegar in general, it is a building block of acetyl coenzyme A, which is just required for energy metabolism in the first place. So when you're driving up acetyl coenzyme A and you're creating this whole kind of cascade, what happens is you have a change or an increase in what is called the AMP to ATP ratio. Now, ATP is our energy currency. So that's kind of when we're taking energy, we're metabolizing it to create ATP, energy, okay? AMP is a precursor to ATP, but it's incomplete. So basically, adenosine monophosphate versus adenosine triphosphate. Long story short, when AMP is elevated, ATP is dropping, that means your AMP to ATP ratio is increasing. Well, in layman's terms, what that means is you're driving up, you guessed it, AMPK once again. The same thing I talked about with the exercise. So just by consuming apple cider vinegar, you're driving up AMPK. And what does that do? Well, it has all these different triggering cascades that help bring glucose into the cell. You're basically inhibiting what's called gene expression in glycometabolism. So basically, you're allowing the activation of just your cell's ability to use glucose better. It's pretty darn awesome. So test it out with that. Again, if you're utilizing any kind of finger stick or a continuous glucose monitor, you can see directly when there is an impact from vinegar. It doesn't have to be apple cider vinegar. I just happen to like apple cider vinegar. Anyhow, moving into the next one, allulose. Okay, now this is something that you can add to a meal, or you can just maybe choose treats that have allulose in it. It's a sugar alternative, but it's a really unique thing with some really compelling research coming out. Okay, allulose has a very similar chemical molecular structure to fructose. Okay, so in the body, it looks a lot like fructose, which means it actually competes for the same transporter as fructose and glucose in the intestinal tract. So that means if you ate a bunch of carbs and you have allulose, there's a fair chance that that allulose may actually hop on the transporter and the glucose does not. Okay, it also inhibits what is called sucrase and maltase. Sucrase breaks down sucrose. So if we're inhibiting the enzyme that breaks down sucrose in the first place, sugar, then think about it. Then we're not breaking down that sugar and it's not getting into the system and not driving blood sugar as high. Same kind of thing with maltase in terms of fructose metabolism. Very cool compound with some cool research too. There was a study that was published in the journal Pharmacology and Therapeutics that demonstrated that allulose does in fact compete for that GLUT5 transporter. Okay, so it does hop on that same transporter that we would see in this case with fructose. But then there was a study that was published in BMJ Open Diabetes and Care Journal. This one was interesting because it actually looked at a human model, what happened when allulose was added into the picture. So in this case, they took 30 subjects, okay, and they divided them into 2 groups, okay? One was a placebo group and one was a group that had allulose. What they did is they gave both groups 50 grams of sugar, okay, just a stable 50 grams of sugar. One group ended up having escalating dosages of allulose, one group had a placebo, okay? Then they did what's called a 7 to 14 day washout period, so they did that, then they switched. Then the group that before had the allulose now got a placebo and vice versa. So very clear in that kind of study dynamic. The results were interesting. There was a dose-dependent decrease in postprandial glucose after 30 minutes after eating in the allulose group. And they saw a progressive increase with the best results at 7.5 grams to 10 grams of D-allulose, which suggests that the more allulose in this case, the more profound the effect at modulating blood glucose. So there's a lot of different mechanisms that could be at play with this. Okay, obviously the glucose transportation could be one, the inhibition of those enzymes that break down the sugars could be one, but the bottom line is still pretty straightforward. Like, using foods that have allulose as a sweetener may help control the blood glucose a little bit better. But what I start to wonder is maybe we could use allulose in adjunct to like other things. Like maybe we have some cake and we're like, darn it, maybe I shouldn't have had that cake. Maybe I shouldn't have sat down and had that whole sheet cake. Well, maybe you could have a little bit of allulose as a sweetener with some tea afterwards, and maybe you get a positive effect. Again, you have to kind of look at your numbers and see where you land with that. The next one that I want to talk about is really simple and basic, okay? If you have control and you know that you've made a bad decision before your glucose goes high, you can mitigate some of that damage by simply adding some fiber or adding some fat to that meal. I would prefer that you add some fiber, because the issue with fat is I don't always like combining fats and carbohydrates in hefty amounts. But if you add some fiber, you add some olive oil or something like that, it does slow down the digestion, making something that might normally drive your glucose way up give you more of a gentle bell curve that you might be able to control. Another one that I want to kind of end with, which is something that people don't think about very often, is how long it takes you to eat. Now, I know I'm kind of working backwards. Before I said, okay, like these are things that you can do after you spike your glucose high. But if you want to be preemptive about it, eating your meals slower can make a pretty tremendous impact. Like I noticed when I looked at my blood sugar, my own anecdotal experience, if I was sitting down and I ate my meal in like a 10-minute period, my glucose would go pretty high. But if I stretched that out to 20 minutes, it made such a difference in terms of what my blood glucose did, simply because, well, I was having time to actually metabolize. It wasn't sending things all cattywampus. It's just things to be paying attention to. So to recap, exercise, flex, squat. Seriously, literally just moving your body is going to make a big impact. Vinegar with a meal or after a meal. Try using allulose, or maybe if you're going to have a treat that is sweetened with some allulose, and even combine it with sugar can still have a potentially good effect. Fiber and fat added to a higher carb meal occasionally just to kind of control that effect. And then lastly, spacing out how long it takes you to eat. Stretch it out a little bit. You'll be surprised at what it can do. I'll see you tomorrow.